Welcome to the Caffeine Stream on Caffeine and Philosophy.
All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the Caffeine Stream. My name is CB Robertson. This is episode 49, and the last time, or maybe it was the time before the last time, I don't remember, I was joined by Sierra. We discussed, among other things, feminism. And so it feels only right to bring some symmetry to our discussions on gender political movements and talk about men's rights advocates, also known as MRAs. Now, were you aware of this movement before you saw that Red Pill documentary, or was that your kind of introduction to it?
I was aware of it dispositionally. I liked men a lot my whole life. But specifically, I'm trying to think of when I first came to know these words, because I like, you know, when you know of a concept but you don't have the name for it, and then you meet the person who gives you the name and you're like, did I know this before you named it for me? I don't know. As long as I have known you, I have known what MRAs are, and like the distinction between an MRA versus a MGTOW, and that these many acronyms. Is that what it's called? Acronyms? Yeah. Anyway, so I mean, I vaguely aware of the fact that, you know, the opposite of feminism is men's rights, vaguely, but you gave me that term, so I've known it for a minimum 10 years.
Well, it is funny that the framing that the opposite of feminism is men's rights still sticks. And I'm sure we'll get into that in a little bit, because it's that in itself is a very funny framing when you look at what these two movements are both going for. My introduction to MRAs and as you pointed out, MGTOWs, which is like related, and there's a lot of overlap in that Venn diagram, but they're not exactly the same. That's the men going their own way. Is what the acronym stands for. And there's like, I don't know if there are any MGTOWs who are not MRAs, but there are certainly MRAs who are not MGTOWs.
Right.
But there is a lot of overlap. Basically, men going their own way means men who have sworn off marriage. It reminds me of those women from the Prohibition days. Is you know, your lips that touch alcohol won't touch our lips. I'm being disparaging. I shouldn't say that.
I don't. Where were you going with that?
All the pictures of those women, they're very ugly.
Oh.
So, I shouldn't be disparaging, but because I, you know, was sort of in that crowd, I suppose, for quite some time. I mean, my introduction to the MRA world was, 2012, 2013, maybe. It was a long time ago. Maybe not quite that far back. I remember writing about it for sure in 2015 for the school. No, it was earlier than that.
Baby, you don't know dates.
I don't know dates. Yeah, I was writing for it for the school paper before we met.
So that's probably late 00s. Early 2010-ish. If for anyone who cares about the linearity.
It was definitely 2012 or after. But regardless, because I was still in the Navy in 2010.
Okay. Hey, I'm distracted by your beautiful watch. Speaking of men going.
Anyways, my introduction was to a woman named Karen Strawn. Karen Strawn was in those days one of the most intellectually interesting YouTubers, I thought, out there. Very, very good stuff.
Who put out, you know, one video a year, but somehow always got tons and tons of views.
Yeah, it was a little more than that, but not much. She was not a daily uploader or anything like that. And I mean, I think the peak of her intellectual prowess was at one point, and this really caught my attention as I like, holy cow, what a good insight. There's a phenomenal Stanford neurology professor named Robert Sapolsky, who has this huge, I highly recommend everyone go check it out. It's worth your time, no matter who you are, no matter what your political or religious interests are. Well, maybe not religious. You get to lecture 17 and maybe your opinions change. But as far as how the human brain works, how human behavior works from a behavioral biologist's perspective, but he did one lecture where he said, look how in men the sex circuitry, or the circuitry for sexual desire, overlaps tremendously with the neural circuitry for violence. And his conclusion was, maybe that's why some men so easily confuse sex with violence in reference to sexual violence, rape, and things like that. And Karen Strawn said, how is that the most intuitive connection? Isn't it so much more intuitive and obvious that the desire for sex would motivate violence in terms of you fight to protect the thing that you love, or in more biological terms, the thing that grants you access to future generations? And like, it was such a, like, you don't hear that kind of layman critique of, college professors that articulately very often. And half of it was how well she put it at the time.
I don't want to sound too clever, but I think also I'm sure that I heard you say that before. In fact, I think I may have heard Karen Strawn's video where she said that. I'm going to layer on, this is where I don't want to come off as too clever. I want to layer on my own interpretation, which this is sort of queuing off. You remember we were talking the other day about how kids who are low in proprioception, I think is the word, really need to like jump around really hard and play really hard and like tumble and like do all this.
Can you refresh our memory on what proprioception is?
I'm trying to tell you. All I know is that it is the need to identify where your body is in space, and the best way to do that is with really rough and tumble hard play.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
And that specifically for a lot of kids who have not had enough time to move their bodies around and like bounce off of walls and jump off of things and like really like feel themselves in space, they'll really benefit from doing that immediately before bed. And it actually helps them, that like ramp up of like dad playing roughly with the kids before bed helps them actually be able to settle down and go to sleep. I was observing, perhaps you recall, that that's not altogether that different from other highly active things that one might do.
Adults do that too.
Immediately before bed. And it's kind of hard to go to sleep if you haven't. And so I would layer on too that what is common as well in both sexuality and violence in men, but also in women, but just maybe with less of an overlap, is that physicality. There's so much physical, like, use of your body. Your body is like so many like hormones, not just emotions.
What's necessary in your sense system to perform the action effectively, it overlaps many different purposes.
Yeah.
So, so like, I think the thing that Karen Strawn and what many of these MRIs, and we'll get to.
It's a good point. What Karen said is a good point, for sure.
And I think, but I think your point is pointing out, like, it's not just that there's one other interpretation. It's that there are, in fact, many, many different reasons why there might be neural circuitry overlap. And what Karen Strawn and what many of the MRIs, and indeed also the MGTOWs and the naughty black sheep cousin, the PUA world, point out, is that the default assumption, even among college professors, often tended to be, according to feminist ideology, far beyond like random chance. Yeah. Like, given the number of possible interpretations of why there might be circuitry overlap there, isn't it interesting that academics in lockstep go with the thing that conforms with feminist theory? Often, as we later find out years later, not just in absence of like validating data, but even contrary to it.
Well, and there's also, I mean, this is going to be the theme of the whole conversation, but it's like once you have established the Overton window, you also establish necessarily its immediate negative, which is the exact opposite of whatever it is. Though those two things, as you just were alluding to, are not the only ways of viewing the situation. Like the Overton window is placed over a particular range. There's a whole picture outside of that window, right?
Yeah.
The negative is not the only alternative.
Right. Which brings me back to your comment earlier about how back in the day it felt as if the opposite of feminism was men's rights activists, which is like how it is perceived from within these movements. But as soon as you get outside of that binary, you're like, these might be two variations of the same idea. And we'll get to that. But I think it's first worth going over a brief history of what the MRA movement is, because I was just chatting with a Navy friend on Twitter, along with a couple of MRAs, and I realized my Navy friend, who is older than me, had no idea what an MRA was. And I was like, holy cow, it's 2023. I forget many people don't know what these niche internet communities are. Next, he'll be saying he doesn't know what Gamergate is. But like, so the thing to understand about, like I was introduced to the MRA world through this Canadian single mom YouTuber named Karen Strawn. Very, very interesting person. She was part of a group that became part of a group, I should say, that became known as the Honey Badgers, but they had some predecessors. One of the big names you will find, and I won't talk about him very much here, is Paul Elam. He's like a voice for men guy. He's kind of an interesting guy in some ways and kind of not interesting in others. But the big OG men's rights activist, and I don't know if he ever called himself one, but he really did start the movement, was a male feminist academic named Dr. Warren Farrell. And he was a very prominent and very academically well-respected scholar, professor, in the 70s. But in the course of his research on gender and on power dynamics, he discovered that the patriarchy narrative, while he still believed it to be true, did not describe the experience of most men. He said, yes, it's true that power is held by men, but it's actually a very small minority of men. Mm-hmm. And most men do not experience the patriarchy as empowering. Mm-hmm. And so...
Which, I mean, I guess is kind of the original patriarchy hurts men too.
Oh, very much so, yes.
Yeah, which you and I would question the original assumption of patriarchy, but that's an episode for another day.
Well, we already did that. We already did that in our previous one, where patriarchy was nonsense. It's not the organizing principle for. I think the summary of our reasoning is like the organizing principle of successful societies is protecting our societies from other groups of men. It's not men dominating women. Mm-mm. Like it's just. I guess
we covered that on the feminist.
Yeah, and there are you can go deeper into that and the reasons why. Like, I mean, you can think about it biologically. Men are more genetically closely related to their female cousins than they are to random men in their society. Mm-hmm. It would make biologically no sense. You would be cutting against the genetic interests of the organism. But anyways, so Warren Farrell, who is this feminist who said, hey, there might be some problems with our theory and how we're treating men, as if they're
all oppressors,
as if they're not just oppressing us, perhaps by accident, but are in fact benefiting from this oppression. Maybe they're not. And so he wrote this book called The Myth of Male Power. And this got him canceled before cancellation was even a thing, before cancellation was a word. But it was very inspiring to a very small group of people who felt very
disenfranchised.
Yes, disenfranchised and also misunderstood and maligned. And but interestingly, and this is where I think we can begin to turn the conversation, which I think there are a lot of positive things to say about men's rights advocates. They brought a lot of very serious issues to the fore. There was a time, as we were talking about before, where you could not criticize feminism without as an ideology, without being thought of, even by ordinary people, as a misogynist.
Yeah.
The disagreement with feminism was identical to misogyny. And I think the MRAs, small as they are, kind of broke that. I think they
gave, at the very least, they gave enough of a foothold that it's not a given.
Exactly. And now I think feminism has, what's ironic is that back to our last conversation, what ultimately broke feminism is completely irrelevant, I think, in our society today. The thing that broke it was not MRAs, it was the transgender movement and the whole what is a woman question. The progressive ratchet continues to eat its own as it advances.
The highest level of feminism is when you become a trans advocate, which is just a men's rights advocate.
Right, and you throw out, and then you throw out your J.K. Rowling books. So aside from,
hang on, you keep teeing it up. You're trying to tell us a little bit about the history of it. So from Warren Farrell, some people took.
Yes. The thing that was interesting was that a lot of the people who took up the MRA cause were not men; they were women, which was interesting. Karen Strawn being, again, one of the more prominent ones, but there are a number of others. The one I was arguing with on Twitter the other day. Also Cassie J, the creator of the Red Pill documentary that you saw.
The current one that we both rather actually enjoy watching is The Dadvocate on Instagram.
Yes, that's a very good example. And she's like, I guess we'd call her like a third wave MRA. She doesn't call herself an MRA, but
no, but I mean, she's definitely expressly a father's advocate. So her whole thing is about is that men should be treated as dads. If they have kids, they should be allowed visitation, all that kind of stuff. That's her axe to grind.
Right. Now,
So tell us about the history. So after Warren Farrell, then who picks it up?
Well, yeah, it's basically Paul Elam for A Voice for Men. And there were a couple guys underneath him or working alongside him. I don't remember their names. They did some interesting debates on college campuses and so forth. But then the real like berserkers of the MRA movement were the Honey Badger Brigade, which were female men's rights activists. They're all women. They have some men they work with. One of my longer term favorite YouTubers, and I don't agree with him on everything, I just like his presentation style, is a guy named Dr. Randomer Cam. Puts out some very interesting, thought-provoking material. Sometimes he can be kind of hit or miss, but when he hits it, it's a real like grand
really
slam. He collaborates a lot with them. But that was where, when I sort of saw where it was going, I put out the video, which to date I believe is still the most disliked video on my YouTube channel, the Why I'm Not an MRA video. And it occurred to me, like, the thing that men are being disenfranchised from is the thing that feminists are blaming them for having, which is power and the experience of power. Now, if you are a man and your aim is respect in a relationship, and you don't have power, but then someone just gives it to you or advocates for you on your behalf, does that give you respect and self-respect? And I think it's universally not true, but it's especially not true for men. And this is where I think it's important to remember that the men's rights advocates movement grew out of feminism itself. It still holds all the same premises, the importance of equality, the importance of civil rights, which is critically different than natural rights. And we might get into that a little bit later. So I put out this video of tremendous, I think there's like 94 comments or something on that video, most of them negative. And like, but the idea that I don't want someone else, arguing on my behalf in a cultural legal context, especially women on a gendered issue, where my power and the respect I receive in society is contingent on someone else sort of doing the work for me. Mm-hmm. That would be self-defeating. I'm sure I could say it a little better, but like that dynamic is, I think, especially harmful. And it's harmful for everybody. It's harmful for blacks. It's harmful for women. It's harmful for any number of these victim advocacy groups. I'm very attached to this acronym of VAGES, victim advocacy group, where they build a constituency by promising political favors and visibility in exchange for you accepting the identity of victimhood. Mm-hmm. And I mean, there's a lot of gravitas to being a victim in a civil rights culture, mm-hmm. because civil rights does not permit victims. So if you are a victim, you are automatically granted the right to, maybe not the reality of, but at least the right to special attention and maybe even special privileges, mm-hmm. to compensate for your victimhood. But there's a cost to that.
Well, I not to direct you in your own podcast, but I feel like that's sort of the end. Well, I don't know. I feel like that's sort of the end conclusion you've come to on it. But like you yourself, mm-hmm. have gone through you researched it and you were like hanging around it. You know how it is on the internet. Like, it's not like you hung around with these people, but you like kind of did, you like texted them and messaged them in Facebook groups and other things like that. You loiter around the internet long enough. And so, I mean, the funny thing about us is it's like, if MGTOWs are in the center of an MRA larger circle, we're like not that far away. We're still agree with a lot of the principles and even some of the aims. As you've said, like, I don't think my conclusion is I don't want anyone to advocate on my behalf, and specifically not those people. And we could maybe get
and not treating me as a like protected Munchausen by proxy, victim puppet, mm-hmm. for their operation,
But there are things that we agree with as far as their
certainly
what their focuses are and their aims.
Beginning with feminism is wrong. Now, they don't even say feminism is wrong exactly. What they say is feminism is horrifically and almost sociopathically hypocritical. Mm-hmm. They say
it fails at its own aims. That's what people say about Christians.
Right.
You feel that you're not even meeting your own standards.
Yeah. MRAs say, that you feminists say you want equality, mm-hmm. but what you are advocating is supremacy. Mm-hmm. And if we wanted real equality, we would look at inequalities across the board, not only inequalities that affect women. Your political constituency, which is women.
Which, I mean, again, I just that sentence alone, I don't disagree with that. Like, mm-hmm. if you want us to take the feminist frame, you'd care about all the inequalities in the world. Like, let's get more female linemen.
Right, and special operations soldiers and so forth.
I want more female plumbers.
Yeah.
I need some female ditch diggers, please. So, no air conditioning. I want equality. Get some rock flippers.
Yes. And of course that runs into, I think, maybe not reductio ad absurdums, but conclusions that run afoul of most people's immediate intuitions. about how a society would run. And here we run into, I think, one of the deeper cruxes of the whole issue. And there are a few of them, but like it's worth dwelling upon the question of rights. I mean, it's in the name, men's rights activist. When they are talking about rights, they are not talking about natural rights. They are talking very specifically about civil rights. And
for my own edification, beloved, please explain to me the difference between natural and civil rights.
yes, so natural rights are what our Constitution is actually founded on, the idea of. And it's the idea that we have certain rights that come from God or nature's God or nature itself or our own nature. They precede government. The rights exist in
Prior to
nature.
government, without
Yeah.
government.
Yeah, prior to ourselves even, perhaps. They exist independently. Civil rights are rights that come from the government. So it's a hair shy of just being privileges, but they're called rights. And that very simple distinction makes a tremendous world of difference in terms of what rights there are. In terms like equality can be considered to be a civil right. It is absolutely not a natural right. Now, there's a sense of equality in the natural rights world that is talked about in not just the Declaration of Independence, but in other documents about how like no one, but it's more of via negativa right of equality. It's a no one has the right of authority.
Yeah.
No one has the right to be
No one's
king.
actually better than us. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and we might all have different propensities and skills, and we might be better at each other in different ways.
But that doesn't, it's not like, one of us was ordained by God.
Right. The natural rights concept of equality is explicitly a repudiation of the divine right of kings.
Right. Not, and it doesn't go so far as like the communists that like, we're all equal. 2 legs are, 4 legs are better than 2 legs.
Yeah. Well, it's funny to think about the divine right of kings. That's like one more concept of rights at work. So
Bring back king's rights.
Well, maybe not.
Short kings. You can play what's that game where you pre-associate?
Yeah. So anyways, the civil rights frame, I think is it's a problem if you're like an American patriot and if you're a fan of the Constitution prior to 1963 or whenever the Civil Rights Law passed. The Civil Rights Act is such a troubling thing for many people, and I think it might be a little culturally early for people to really seriously entertain criticisms of the Civil Rights Act. They're already out there. We already had, what was that book with the horrific title but the really good content? It's like
the babe that describes half of the books you love.
I think it's called The Age of Entitlement, and I forget the author's name.
Oh yeah.
Worst title ever. It sounds like one of those like churned out conservative bestsellers that doesn't mean anything, but it's actually quite good, and it basically talks about that.
Who is that?
Deviation, the bifurcation of the Constitution on this framework of rights, and it forces us into some very silly and ridiculous places on the far end, and we're seeing some of that now, especially with the gender stuff, trans stuff in sports. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with women in the military, women in special forces, these things that run afoul of our intuitions but are now legally required, essentially.
So I keep coming back to it because I want to like describe some of the things that MRAs are aiming for or trying to achieve that you and I'm speaking as in the royal we, but like that are why we would not consider ourselves MRAs, but we're like adjacent. Because
the short answer is, to start with, we are not only married, but
no, I know that. I mean, like, what are the things that they're aiming for? Like, what are their positions?
Oh,
What are
not-
things that
not their-
MRAs are trying to do?
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Not their short-term advocacy,
Yeah,
but they're actually their long-term policy goals.
Yeah.
Well, they want equality. They want equality between the sexes legally. Now, people think that's already true, right? Or if anything, there's like legal bias against women or something. And they point to family court cases, and they point to child custody. They point to not just alimony, but also child support. And there's a wide range of hosts. The MRIs actually have, I think, a very, not just an airtight, but a very wide ranging and broad collection of stories and data fairly thoroughly demonstrating the legal bias against men in many, if not all cases. Maybe not all, I don't know. Most cases for certain. So they want to correct that. They want to correct the asymmetry in that perverts the incentives of marriage, because as it stands, and this is unfortunately fairly well documented in at least a number of cases, when a divorce is happening, if you follow the money, which predicts very well, the lawyers get a lot more money, and in fact the women get a lot more money if they allege abuse, physical abuse. And in a he said, she said kind of situation,
which all marriages to some degree are.
Right. It's very hard for a man to prove he didn't do something. And this is the problem with not just the Duluth model of physical violence, which these MRIs have pointed out, the problems with this model, which has become prevalent in many therapy circles, if not all therapy circles in North America. Which is just the feminist model of abuse, which is basically it's always the man's fault.
Yeah.
Is the burden of proof.
If you feel like it was his fault, it was his fault.
Right. Well, the problem is that these frameworks that they establish actually eliminate or even invert the burden of proof in many cases. You have to prove that you weren't abusive if the allegation is made. And because the dynamic itself is often believed or argued to be abusive. And it creates a dynamic that, of course, a lawyer whose goal is to maximize the money for his client and for himself will often push the woman to say, you should say this. Yeah. And the nature of marriage itself, of course, is there's a lot of gray areas where you're trying to negotiate or work things through. And a lot of times the difference between an ordinary conversation or abuse, and here we can include psychological abuse, right?
Which I have to admit, I feel like the term psychological abuse is the catch-all term for when I couldn't pin you with any of the other actually documentable or provable or in any way discernible externally actual kinds of abuse, but I still want to make sure that I bludgeon you with this term.
Right. It's entirely subjective.
Yeah.
And the difference even to someone's own sincere belief between abuse and an ordinary disagreement. Yeah. Or even not a disagreement in some cases, is often retroactive framing. It's the context around an event that can reframe it, and sometimes your own desires serve that role.
I was gonna say also that's like it's the what becomes abuse is like if it's trying to make a physical model idea. There are the things that come into the situation with you, all of your past history and your precepts and your concepts and things that you come in, that you enter into a situation with. Then there are the event, the actual activities that happen in the event. And then there's all of the like justifications and rationalizations that come after. And it's like, if you're primed to view somebody shouting as abuse, if you're primed to see someone punching through the wall as abuse, when you see that in a fight, you'll be like, that's abuse. And then later, all your friends will go, oh my God, he like yelled at you and punched through the wall. Like, oh my God, that he sounds like terrifying, whatever. Oh my God, are you being abused? And it's like, there is so much there that with slightly different, the same events when viewed through a slightly different filter, not coming with these expectations that, such and such behaviors mean abuse, could make the whole thing different. Like for me, I would be picking up way more on, I'm just making a fabricated scenario here that involves a guy punching in the wall, but I would be way more interested in the words that he's saying, because I personally have witnessed men who are punching the wall out of sheer frustration with their own inability to be able to say what they're trying to say. It's not in any way threatening toward her. Yeah. It's his own frustration, which, is it maladaptive? Sure. Yeah. Don't punch holes in walls, dudes. But get words. Yeah. But it's like that is a substantive and significant difference about how to interpret the events that happened in a fight that is so different depending on not just your past experience, but also your rationalization afterward. It's both and before and after.
Well, and here it's almost like the feminists have a point in that abuse is not a linear, clear-cut thing that you can define, because there are contexts in which punching a wall could be abuse. It could be a very real physical threat. However, if a man says, hey, hold my beer, I'll bet I could punch a hole through a wall, and then punches a hole through a wall, it would be pretty abusive, we might say, to interpret that 5 years later as a threat, which, and things like that do happen. But
it's, well, you're giving it that's like one shade beyond the highly, I'm thinking of it like a chromatic color scale. It's like very, very subtly warmer on the color scale. The difference between I'm going to punch the wall next to your head versus I am so frustrated with myself trying to come up with something to say over here, nowhere near you. Am I threatening you? And some people will still look at, me punching a wall over here by myself, nowhere near you, and not in any way making aggressive movements toward you, the same way. And it's obviously a guy goofing off is is even cooler.
It's weaponized mind reading. And what feminism did was create a frame of male intention. That's essentially what patriarchy theory is. It's a theory of collective male intentionality that frames all male action and existence even as controlling. Much as we see a lot of the race stuff conflating whiteness with dominance at this very weird, abstract, sorcery kind of level. It's a bunch of bullshit. But
and as though women are not well known and documented for the ways in which men will kill you, women will make you want to die. If you've crossed women, right? We're us and our gossip mongering and our ability to the slight disposition more toward that verbal intelligence and verbal communication. You can't tell me that women aren't out there, mentally abusing their husbands just as much as men are supposedly abusing their wives.
For sure. Well, but let's dwell on that for a moment, because women are abusive, manipulative, all these other things, and now we have a theory, a framework with the men's rights activists that articulates this, and it has all this data to back it up, and it has all this stuff, and we can talk about data in a little bit too. And now let's go back a minute to when you were talking about priming before, and how a lot of abuse, or what is interpreted retroactively as abuse, is more the result of how we are primed to interpret things than the action itself.
Yeah, ex nihilo in and of itself.
The thing that worries me about men's rights activists is we have created a mirror dynamic. And I shouldn't say we, because I'm peripherally involved, but not an active member. I'm not a card-carrying men's rights activist. And
Yes, no, the married
thankfully.
man with 3 daughters.
Yeah. But like they have created their own version of this, where they create this idea of a gynocracy, a rule by women, where gynocentrism, or female centeredness in society is the prevailing theory, as well as, and this is maybe the most, if there is one term you could learn to understand the spiritual framework of men's rights. Spiritual is probably not the right word. The kind of the mental framework of men's rights advocacy position as far as where men are in society. It is the phrase male disposability. This came out in some of Karen Straughn's videos. I think it was an idea put forth by Warren Farrell, actually. I could be wrong on that. I don't remember the origin of the phrase. But it's like one of the key ideas, and it has the merit of actually being more than a little bit true. It is sort of biologically true, because, as some biologists have pointed out, if you have a society of 100 people, if you have one male and 99 women,
Society will grow.
You have a future generation. If you have one female and 99 men, A, you don't have a future generation, and B, you have a whole lot of trouble besides. So men are by nature more disposable. And so in order to rise in value, men have to go and do things. And I think this is, at a very core level, one of the merits of natural rights over civil rights, is it acknowledges some of these distinctions. And you might hear an MRA say, well, that's the naturalistic fallacy. Just because something is doesn't mean that's how it should be. Broken arms happen in nature. That doesn't make them good. The fact that male disposability is a biological fact doesn't mean that's how a civil society, how a good society
should
ought
treat
to
their
act.
men. Yeah.
And there you get into some very interesting, very deep philosophical debates about first principles.
Well, and I was just thinking too, it's like you've got, I think, to what you said earlier, to the degree that men are very deeply motivated to strive, because like on some, very, very subconscious level, I think all men are aware of their relative disposability. Like, you need to be achieving something, or you need to like make something of yourself in order to get a wife, get a family, have a career, do something with your life. It is for that reason that these men's rights groups will always be, to some degree, at odds with the motives of their own constituency, because being given the rights or having the pathway made for you is like, okay, you just move the goalpost a little further of how much I need to do in order to be, in my own estimation, right, respectable. So it's like, it's a little bit at odds with their own motives. I can't deny that, at least, again, so I am one shade away from honey badgerism. So, like, I'm very pro a lot of the legal aims and things that the MRAs have, because I do think we have, like, a huge disposition to assume that in custody situations, I think we have a huge disposition to assume that women are always the safest and best. I remember seeing, oh man, where did I see this? It was an old video. Maybe this was in the Red Pill video, but she was talking, it was a gal who, again, had been a feminist back in the 70s, who was doing women's shelters, and the policy was always to let the women come in with their kids. And she very quickly realized that, like, way more dangerous than many of these kids' fathers, who they were quote unquote fleeing for domestic violence reasons, were these mothers toward their own children. They were like, they didn't know how to control themselves to not hit their kids and not just scream at their kids and things like this. And she was like, oh man, we got a real issue here. Then, like, these women's shelters need to be rehabilitating these women to stop being abusive toward their children. We cannot assume necessarily that even in a domestic violence situation where maybe she's having to flee him, that he's treating the kids that way. Like you can't come in with that assumption. This was like back in the 70s, I think. But anyway, that story being a launch point to say just that, like, we shouldn't be assuming necessarily that men are bad fathers. We shouldn't be assuming necessarily that men are always the aggressors. My experience of men, I know I have not met every man, is that a lot of them have a tendency to just, their ability to bear things that make them unhappy and truly like let it go is so anathema to me as a woman. I don't know how you guys do it. Like, you're just literally not chuffed about stuff that would be so annoying I wouldn't be able to stop talking about it until it stopped.
It's because we're armed with the nothing box.
Oh God. This fantasy place no way. You can't.
It's that old spaghetti brain versus compartmentalized box brain analogy.
Yes,
maybe.
but
I don't know.
To the point of a lot of these MRAs, like I see all these annoying feminists trying to act like, men get such, women's pain is so denied at hospitals. I'm like, have you ever seen a man go to the doctor? He could be bleeding from like a critical artery, and the doctor will be like, so do you have any questions? And he'll be like, nope, I'm good. Like whatever.
Our weakness is really the flu. Injuries, injuries we can take all day, but that cold will really take us down.
It'll take you down for a whole week. Oh, no, babe, can I get a Tylenol? No, well, but my experience of men, the men I know for sure in my own personal life, will absolutely get walked over by a doctor. The problem with the medical system, at least in my opinion, this is where where I would say I differ, at least personally, between with MRAs, is not that like we need men's pain to be noticed too, so that then the feminists can be like, yeah, but what about women's pain?
Then you get
that no
victim escalation.
Right. It's like, no, doctors need to actually like give a shit. Doctors, the way the medical system works needs to be more respective of actually paying attention to patients and finding out what their problems actually are and actually dealing with symptoms. Like, but that's I guess that's where you and I go separate from the MRAs. They've got a lot of good aims around like medical care, around the prison system, around marriage, and around children and things like that, child custody courts and that sort of stuff. The MGTOWs go a step further and say, because of all of these risks, I'm just not going to buy into any of this stuff. And I think we're of the position that, like, I mean, obviously Chris isn't a MGTOW, but like, the problem with MGTOWs is that you can't just check out, dude. First of all, the feminists will come for you eventually in every corner of wherever you are. Also, companionship. Don't you want somebody to be with you? Everyone wants somebody.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could check out, and many of these MGTOWs claim to be quite happy. But I think, like, if you are checking out on moral grounds, saying it is not right, and so we're going to check out to like go galt against the unjust system, you're cutting off your nose to spite your face.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, no matter how much they say, the vast majority of your life, the government does not influence. I mean, at a very small level, the government influences everything we do.
It's a little Pareto principle. It's like 80% of your troubles will come from that 20% of the time you actually have to deal with the government.
I mean, at an experiential level, perhaps, like when you go to the DMV, you suddenly feel like the government is ruining everything, and then the next day you forget all about it.
Yeah, 80% of the time you're completely unbothered.
Yeah, except it's with the government, it's more like 99 and 1. Like 90, like your relationship really is not determined by the government. And my thinking is, like, if your relationship is going sideways, like, first of all, it's not the government's fault. But second of all, at the point where the government incentives are strong enough to push your spouse into divorcing you and taking half your stuff, as they always talk about, and that is an injustice. That is something that needs to get fixed. But at the point that is a danger, like the government didn't push them to that point. Now, it is worth saying,
Mm-hmm.
like, if the government incentives weren't there, maybe you would have a greater chance of recovering. That is like worth remembering, but still, it's still far more in your control than the people who say, because of the statistics, and we'll get to statistics in a moment, I don't want to forget that, and because of the incentives, it's just luck and you're probably fucked.
Yeah, okay, so let's back it out. So there's the MGTOWs, who I would say are the farthest along, who are so disenfranchised with the whole system that they're just like, I'm not going to participate, right? So they're not, they refuse to date women, or like certainly won't cohabitate with them or date them for any long period of time. They're not going to get married. They're not going to have kids. And it's like, well, good for you. Those ideologies just died with you because you didn't make any kids. And you'll probably enjoy
in before those guys are like, no, you can't have kids outside of marriage. It's like, yeah, and you're gonna fuck over your kids.
Well, yeah, at least you're going to make it very much more logistically challenging. If, as you say, and I think this is, oh man, I have an attitude with people who are like, you know, you and I have no problem at all in principle with like outlaw marriages. Like, you don't need the state to codify your
I
relationship.
think they're kind of awesome, honestly.
They're, you know,
they're kind of cool.
but to the degree that you believe that these incentives about relationships and custody and those sorts of things exist, giving away your legal right over it. How do I say it? I was trying to come up with the right analogy for this before too. It's like in a litigious world, saying I'm going to represent myself is only fucking you. Like, you coming to court, if you know you're going to court, if you're like, there's no way I'm getting out of this situation without going to court because of the incentives around, you know, marriage and relationships and whatever, just not getting married doesn't actually save you necessarily from the incentive problem of bad relationships that need to get sorted out in courts. And not being married becomes yet another one of the markers of what's wrong with your relationship that justify them taking all your stuff, right? So it's like, don't take away one of your only pieces of armor that you can use to your benefit because you're like, well, in principle, this shouldn't be happening. It's like, okay, you're just hanging yourself out to dry with that. So it's like, you've got MGTOWs who have gone totally their own way, that's literally in the title. You got MRAs who in general are pursuing these kinds of, like, you know, the problems with marriage are so pervasive. The problems with, you know, the court systems are so pervasive. The prison system, the medical system, blah, blah, blah. Military, so unfair for men, blah, blah. The school system, all of those things. Those people are still taking the frame that, like, what we should do about it then is make it more legally fair. We should, you know, be advocating for ourselves and whatever. And I don't, in principle, disagree, except to the degree that it focuses so minutely on these legal mechanisms. And like you were just alluding to, if you're in a place where the offer that the government has for your woman is so much better than what you have to offer her, that she would rather flip on you and do it by herself with the aid of the government. But you can't tell me, if you've ever interacted with the federal government, federal or state, I don't know a single state that has, like, we filed in our state for paid family leave, which they insist on taking out of your income at your job. And so we're like, hey, I want some of that money back. I'm having the qualifying event and we had a baby. I want my state paid leave that you took out of my income over the last...
It took him friggin' 6 weeks, 7 weeks to... Well,
right? It's like, you can't tell me that, you know, being on the dole is the world's easiest route. It's not. It's not impossible. Obviously, there are social workers and blah, blah. There are plenty of people who will help you get signed up. But it's also not exactly, like, easy. It's going to be hard either way, right?
Yeah.
These guys who have gotten to the place where they think that it is, the incentives are so strong that there's nothing that they as an individual can do to overcome those incentives to try to keep a woman's interest or keep your wife's interest, mother of your children's interest, is, I feel like, to me, this is where we get back to it being a victims advocacy group, because they're taking a victim mindset that there's nothing they could have done differently. And it's like, dude, I can think of one thing in two balls that might be doing a better job than what the government can do for your wife. You know what I'm saying?
Right. And I mean,
that deserved a laugh. Do you get my joke?
I did. I'm sorry. No, it's hard to. Shoot, I lost my train of thought. Your joke. Yeah. Well, it's so here. I think this sort of goes back to the whole civil rights versus natural rights problem. If the fundamental issue here is power / respect, but mostly power, how much power are you really gaining if your solution to the problem is to bring the government in more? You know, and it's like it's as you were just saying, it's more of that victim mindset. Oh, daddy, government, please come save me.
Yeah. And stop her from leaving. I don't want her to go. I don't want to have to do anything, but I don't want her to go.
Right. I think we have to grant that the MRAs are correct in many of their legal diagnoses and in many of their propositions as well, as far as making things more fair. However, there is a danger in the mindset that keeps you there. Yeah. And I do want to get into the statistics thing now, because the MRAs, as the feminists do, have a lot of statistics at their Now, unlike the feminists, the MRA statistics are a little bit more accurate. The feminist stats are just laughable.
Insert girls aren't good at math joke.
The gender pay gap, the freaking 1 in 4 girls raped in college. It's like, this is all like, and anyone who has ever been on a college campus knows that's not true. You know, as like you
didn't even have to rape her.
You don't even have to look that up. With the MRA stats, some of them actually are wrong, but you actually have to look them up to know why. So, like, one of the more common MRA stats that they will bring up is the fact that America has a 50% divorce rate. Now, this is one of those lies, damn lies, and statistics situations where, on paper, that is true.
Numerically, it's true.
However, it's not all
marriages are created equal.
Well, it's not predictive for someone who is considering getting married. So suppose you're a 24-year-old kid and you've got your 23-year-old girlfriend, maybe fiance, and you're like, oh man, I really love her, but man, what are my odds of getting divorced? Man, it's 50%. No, it's not. It's not 50%. What the 50% number includes is, first of all, serial divorcees. And here we go back to the Pareto principle thing you were talking about before. There are a small number of people who
love to sign documents, apparently.
Apparently, yeah. Who have been through like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 marriages. You know, just absurd numbers of marriages.
I can think of a handful of people who I know personally who are on their third.
Right. And they drive up the number of, and of course these people, they haul their relational problems around with them. And
yes, I didn't work on myself. I just got a new wife.
Right. And so if you've been divorced before and you didn't go to therapy, you didn't actually therapy probably won't help these days, but like didn't do some work.
You didn't even read a book. Didn't even read a book.
Didn't even read. Like, try to figure out what went wrong. Like, your odds of divorce the next time you get married are probably 90%. Yeah. You know, but if you exclude those people from
I think we got these numbers when we were, at the time we were both more nominally Christian, and so we were getting advice from a pastor, but he's like, when you actually winnow that number down into like
people with common values,
people with matching religions, people with matching religion and first-time marriages have like a 90% success rate.
Yeah, it's actually quite good, and there's a small number of pathological people who drive that number up. And this is like bring some like Nassim Taleb mathematics into the equation. And so that can be extremely misleading, but they like to beat you over the head with it.
Well, and then there's the second level to it, which is also like the truth that all of us probably know, and we're probably told at some class at some point. You've heard this, but it's very hard to forget it, like, or to bring it to mind at the times when you really need it, which is that statistics mean nothing for the individual.
Yes, this is the point I was wanting to get to.
Because it's like knowing how everybody else is doing. For some reason, I think people find it very informative. This is kind of harkening back to our episode on polls.
This is like, the symptom. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting your point. It does harken back to that poll. But
it harkens back to the episode on polling to the degree that it makes you feel like you're somehow getting information that will help you make a more informed choice. Mm-hmm. And the truth is, first of all, there are so many things that could happen in a marriage that aren't divorce, but that also could throw you for a loop that you could not possibly predict. Just things, random occurrences, job opportunities, family members dying, your spouse dying in a car accident. I mean, the things that are almost completely outside of your control and certainly outside of the purview of your marriage that will happen to you while you are married. And none of the statistics in the world are going to help you figure out how to navigate that or when that's going to, I mean, it doesn't give you any information at all, actually. Yeah.
And I think it's also, I want to bring up one more very common statistic that the MRIs will throw out, which is that 70% of divorces
are started by the woman.
Out of the blue, presumably. There was no preamble, there was no escalation, there was no male withdrawal, there was no female criticism before the male withdrawal, there was no male
there was no pattern of disconnect and just moving apart with no move back together.
Right, and this is kind of the problem.
One more statistic to throw to the pile, because you mentioned this the other day that I thought was funny, that the self-reported success of marriage counseling.
God, yes.
They have like a 95% success rate.
No, between 96 and 99% success. Now, what would you think?
What do you think? What's the definition of success?
Now, what would you think would be the success rate of marriages that go through counseling with a 96 to 99% success rate?
It should be very high, shouldn't it?
It should be at least 25%. You would think, right? It would be at least a 25% survival rate of marriage, but it is not. It's like 20.
Well, and I mean, again, with like the information that's hidden behind these statistics, it's like, okay, so what's a 90? Let's take a conservative view.
That's more like feminist statistics than it is like MRA statistics. It's like the most tortured numbers you've ever seen in your life.
I like, to be generous, I'm going to assume that like a 95% success rate means like 95% of the customers
self-reported that it was helpful.
Yeah, self-reported that was helpful.
Vague way.
And maybe the only people who are going are ones who are like on the rocks anyway. So like at least we counseled our way out of this instead of, just struggling at home and not committing to whether we're getting a divorce or not. I don't know. I can't fathom how any reputable adult can stand by a 95% success rate for marriage.
It gets down to the boundary problem of the vagueness of these labels. Like, what does success mean? What does female initiated really mean? Obviously, it means the woman filed the papers, but you can get into situations where someone began to like we were talking about before. What really started? Well, if a man cheats on a woman, and then the woman files the papers, who initiated? Yeah. Like, and you have all kinds of problems like that. And statistics do?
Who initiated the fact that he had to go cheat? What if she, stopped?
Which is actually a legitimate question sometimes.
Sometimes it is.
Yeah. I mean, and that's a hard thing that both feminists and MRAs will say, that's victim blaming. And victim blaming is a way of defending, the concept of victim blaming is a way of defending the arbitrary starting point of a
Yeah.
statistical phenomenon.
Yep.
Like and refusing to look at any cause. And the problem with this is that it is a symptom of the victim mindset. These things just happen to me.
Yeah.
And it's an incredibly disempowering, again, power is the theme here. It's an incredibly disempowering way of going through the world that like, oh, if I'm getting into a thing that has a 50% chance of failure, because I believe the statistics, that means I will have a 50% chance of failure because I'm just, it's not up to me. These things just happen to me.
Yeah. Well, and I've seen a number of people, and this is not to make this whole thing into a discussion of marriage, but like I've seen many people who we've known personally who they'll be very reticent to commit to getting married, who date for 4 or 5 or 6 years. And Chris and I being, people who very much wanted to like, both of us very much wanted to be married and we wanted to make babies. So we're like, we're married and trying for a baby all in the same year. We're like, we're not dating to married and yeah, we're not trying for babies within a year, but that's, we're not normal. Many people will have this long period of time of like really dragging out the dating period, or they'll live together for like 4 or 5 or 6 years. And our attitude is like, why not be married for that time? Like literally at this point, what's the difference? You've been living together this whole time. Like, what is the difference? And for some people, they'll have this hang up that they're like, well, like I'm thinking of one friend and one couple specifically, both of whom had parents who had very like messy, awful divorces, and that they struggled with themselves as the children of those divorce houses. And so they were very reticent to like put the marriage label on it and commit to it because they're like, what if it goes like that? And our perspective, being not fundamentally victims, is that we're like, what you're doing.
What steps can we take to not do that?
Yeah.
And it turns out it's not that hard.
It's not that hard. And also like it starts with just asking yourself, like, what is the difference between being married and what you're doing currently? Because what you're doing currently is in every way playing house, but just without the label. Do you think that there's something about the word marriage, like once you are husband and wife instead of just boyfriend, girlfriend who live together, that will make you get divorced? And it's like, well, necessarily you would have to be married to, if that relationship fell apart, get divorced, obviously. But like the breakup behavior could exist now. There's not a functional difference, but you're eschewing the label because I guess you're thinking that like you can't get divorced. You can't get divorced if you never got married. And it's like, yes, but you can still have your heart broken. You can still get broken up with. You can still go through all the trials of a relationship falling apart in the state you're in right now. And if you think it's going to hurt less if you're not married.
Well, they're worried about losing half their stuff and all that legal fallout.
Well, and then the end result on these particular friends is at some point when they'd been dating for quite a while, they said that they were going to play the gender game. And guess who's married and has 2 kids now? So they played and they found out, I guess. Yeah. And in this case, I'd like to argue they played a good game and they found out.
Good for them, yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, frankly, if they had gone their entire lives dating, like, and just living together and never having kids, like, whatever, at least you have somebody. We're certainly, we would rather have you have somebody than you have nobody.
Well,
so
I think that's what it comes down to at the end of the day for me, even above everything else we've talked about so far, above the victim mindset thing, above the like vicarious championship of men by women. Is
the BS statistics.
Yeah, it's like at the end of the day, I can't think of anything more existentially significant than bringing a child into the world. Not making a multi-million-dollar business, not writing a book. Nothing is more existentially significant than making a child. And nothing is more natural and important to a human being, I think, than romantic companionship.
Yeah.
And like, and those two things together are like, whether you want to do it officially and legally or not, are marriage, essentially. It's, if you're a biologist, you might call it pair bonding or whatever, but like marriage is like an institutionalized human version of pair bonding. And you're not going to pair bond without doing some semblance of that.
Yeah.
And the thing that bothers me, and here the feminists again led the way, and MRAs from their origin were an offshoot of feminism, just in the other way, doing the same thing. They're taking an individualist risk management view, where they're saying, I don't think it's worth the risk to be with a man. It's too dangerous. Or to be with a woman. It's too legally dangerous instead of physically dangerous or whatever. Or psychologically in either case.
Yeah.
And you see this logic with antinatalists too, morally, or just hedonists financially. Kids aren't worth it.
Yeah.
And it's like it's like the thing that is being risked has been inverted.
Yeah.
Like you're trying to mitigate risk in most cases to prolong and preserve your life so that you can do other things worth doing. I think there's a lot of people on the right who will say, "Oh, such and such philosophy is the philosophy of yeast, just unrestricted growing life for life's sake is the philosophy of bacteria," or whatever. I think it's a stupid view, because the life that humans live is not life like yeast. We're doing things.
Yeah.
But you get something close to that if you're taking hedonism at the expense of children and romantic companionship, I think.
Well, and you brought up the conservatives, and I think this is something that Jordan Peterson really brought to the table on that kind of rights versus responsibilities. The thing that the right always had wrong, I think, about the advocacy of marriage and children and stuff, is that they very much positioned it as being like, you got to take on this responsibility. It's so important. This is the most important thing you'll do in your life. And then they just kind of sent you on your way to figure it out and to just struggle. And if it comes alongside with that kind of, happy wife, happy life, like whatever kind of, that sort of guidance, if that's all the guidance you were given to try to then make relationships work, like you basically were completely wildly unprepared for the real task of what's going to happen to you. And so making it either like we should avoid risks that are too risky, and so we should pursue like rights and privileges that will, basically make it more fair for us so that the risk is lower, or that the risk is more fair, or whatever, which is kind of the MRA and feminist view. You've got the kind of old world, it's not even like necessarily conservative, but just the traditionalist view, which is that like, but you're supposed to get married and you're supposed to have kids. And so, it's your responsibility to do those things, but with no skills to be able to actually pull it together. I think that the more correct view, the one that I think we have, is that with marriage and with children, it's both and. You are supposed to be getting something out of it, for sure. Companionship, hopefully somebody who will visit you when you're old, future generations, etc., etc. And you do need to manage some of the risk, right? You don't just marry anybody. You don't just make children with anybody. You pick somebody, you try to, go into it with stacking the deck as hard in the direction of positive, and you try and set yourself up for success as best as you can by getting to know somebody. That's why you date. You don't just pick someone and say like, hello, you're my husband now. You think about it, you work on it, you get to know them. And then you have the responsibility of, once you've made the commitment, you need to follow it through. And the thing is, at least this is my opinion, like 60% of the stuff that will happen to you in your life, you had no control over it. Like who your parents are and where you grew up and like random chance crap that, you know, like whether it rains today. 60% of the stuff that happens to you, you have no control over. But that 40% that you do have control over, you can really move the needle of what kinds of random stuff will happen to you significantly.
And it's cumulative.
Yes, it like snowballs. And so, you know, if you do your best to find someone who is as good of a match for you as you can possibly be, and then once you've made that commitment, you continue to try to grow toward that person as you're making kids and you're starting new jobs and that sort of thing, when those other random things happen. Because, I mean, I know this is a phrase that like the MRAs will often say. They'll be like, oh, well, if she cheats on you and she takes all your stuff and she asks for the divorce or whatever, like, does that, you know, was your marriage? It's not even worth it. Let's change the scenario a little bit. If instead of cheating on you and then getting divorced and taking all your stuff and you never get to see your kids, whatever this horrendous, you know, MRA hellscape is, what if instead your wife is driving along and a semi-truck tips over onto the minivan that's holding you and your wife and all your kids? Your entire family just died. That would not make your marriage. No one would ask the question, was your marriage worth it? Because that complete freak random thing happened. Again, I'm not saying that, and I think we've talked about this before. I'm not saying that there's no, that getting your spouse cheating on you or getting served with divorce papers or whatever are as random as a semi-truck tipping over and crushing your entire family. However, to the degree that you have the ability to know the outcome ahead of time, whether it ends poorly is not actually an indication of whether you were wrong to have made the choice in the first place.
It's like poker. The best you can do is bet correctly, and sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. But if you are betting correctly, over time, wow, things work out very well. And I think this is a really good point to, and maybe we can work to closing it up because we've been going for a while. But one of the things that MRAs will also say is, you don't know who you're marrying.
Oh God.
You think you know, but let me tell you, I have a friend who thought he knew who he married, but then. Man,
as soon as she got that ring on her finger,
everything changed after 8 months or after 2 years or after 10 years. Suddenly things happen. And
after she had that baby, and
I mean, first of all, it is possible. It could be like the semi-truck thing, but like I would bet money maybe 8, maybe 9 times out of 10 that they are excluding a lot of things that
would have made it predictable for anyone who is outside of the situation. And also,
right.
I agree with the premise that you don't know who you're marrying, because the thing is, who I married was a 23-year-old man who didn't have a career established yet and had never fathered any children, had never cared for 4 kids before. I have to admit, I married you on your word that you wanted to have a lot of kids, but I'm not going to lie, I can't think of a single instance where you and I in our dating life, for any reason ever, were around small children. Mm-hmm. I don't think I had never seen you in the company of a baby until I made one and handed it to you. Which is not to say that I didn't know you when I married you. I did know you, but like the person who you are now, necessarily
who we became, like we each participated in our own transformation. How many people live separate lives, and then suddenly you wake up and you're like, wow, my partner's a completely different person. How did this happen? Oh. They didn't stay static over.
Well, I was not
year.
Looking at them exactly.
Yeah. Or maybe I didn't cause them to change through my own negligence and stuff. But I think more importantly, and this gets to kind of some existential stuff, sort of like the civil rights versus natural rights stuff, but like one of my favorite books in the Bible, and I've said my piece about Christianity before, but one of my favorite books in the Bible is Job, who all this bad stuff happens to him. Mm-hmm. And he's like, but I did nothing wrong. Mm-hmm. And his friends come to him and they say,
like, are you sure?
They say, you must have done something wrong. And like, he insists that he didn't, but he wants to know why. He is curious about it. Mm-hmm. And he asks God for an explanation, because at the very end, his friends are like, well, if you did nothing wrong, you should curse God to his face for being unjust. And he doesn't do that. He's like, I know I didn't do anything wrong.
And I know God is just.
But what happened here? And that curiosity, I think, ends when you just accept statistic. Well, this is just the odds. And like, there was something that you could have done differently. And even, and here's the crazy thing, I think. This is a
for
positively...
those of you who may be listening who are not super familiar with the book of Job, which is a bit archaic, the end is that it was a bet between God and Satan that they could break this unbelievably holy man by killing all of his family and burning all of his crops and basically ruining his life. And then his friends all came and they're like, you obviously brought this on yourself. And he's like, I swear I didn't. And at the final end, God's like, actually,
who are you to question me?
Who are you to question me? So even at the end, he didn't really get a super good answer.
But yeah,
it was a shitty day for Job.
That's how old religions and old gods worked. But but it's a fascinating book, and I think it's a window and an insight into the unpredictability of nature, but also the difference that different outlooks can have, the different spiritualities, that different approaches to responsibility. And this will be a very strange segue, but I was at work and I was talking to we'll just say a coworker. He was actually a property manager, but like it was there with me as I was doing some work.
Working.
Yeah. And you know, he mentioned seeing the story about an inscription on the inside of a cell in Auschwitz, or one of these concentration camps in Germany from World War II, where some Jewish inmate had written on a wall. It says, God will have to beg for my forgiveness for what he has allowed to happen to our people. And this guy, okay, I can spark some interesting conversations with all kinds of people. I said, wow, that's so interesting. That's one way of looking at it, because I could think of another inmate in a similar kind of concentration camp that was in a similar situation, but came to an exactly different conclusion.
Are you thinking of Viktor Frankl?
No, although he's another good example. No, I was thinking of Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
Oh, yes.
Who was in the gulags of Russia, concluded, you know what, maybe we brought this on ourselves. Maybe we weren't vigilant enough. And maybe he even has this line, it's like, maybe if a few of us had met the Soviets at the door with guns, all of this could have been prevented, if we had done that early on. It's a very, very ballsy thing to write down. I guess he was already in the gulag at the time, but but he basically decided to take personal responsibility and say, you know what, I think we could have done something better about this. And it's a very like Jocko Willink extreme ownership kind of approach, and it's actually irrational in most cases. Like, you didn't have control, but if you get in that mindset, what happens is your domain of control, your power, actually begins to expand, because you see things, you look for things that you weren't looking for before.
To borrow my own analogy, if we were to say that 60% of the things that happen to you are totally out of your control, that does not therefore mean that you should relinquish even a single other drop of your responsibility. You should be occupying all 40 other percent. You know what I'm saying? And so many people, I think they do, their disposition is to be like, well, I can't control it. Oh, I guess this random thing happened. And they slowly become down to like that. They're those people only using 10% of their brain. It's like you could be fully you could be fleshing out all the way to your fullest capacity of your power, because you'll find that a lot of the things that you can't control,
neuroscience students will go, why that's funny.
If you really flesh out to the fullest extent of your control, you'd start to see that small flexion between like, can I control this or not? And asking yourself that question, like, could I do something about this or not? Instead of like, oh, whatever's going to happen is what's going to happen.
Or better yet, how could I do something about
How could
this?
I do something about it? Exactly.
Instead of could I, how could I do something about this?
And so, for instance, not that no one asked for marriage tips from us, but like, hey, do a podcast together. Because you know what? Nothing brings you together like having a cluster around a tiny lav mic in the evening together.
And what would you say then to the MRA who says, or the MGTOW, because these two have been fusing in the last few years, I've noticed, who says, well, we are taking control. We are taking responsibility, and we're doing the thing that is within our control, and in fact is quite empowering, and that is abstaining from marriage.
Well, good luck. My guess is you're probably still going to seek the occasional comforts of a woman. I'm sorry that you have to pay per visit.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I'm sorry that your ideas and your level power of influence is going to die with you. Whatever, especially the hard MGTOWs who are like just giving up on all of it. I'm like, at least the MRAs are trying to have some kind of legal ramification for it. But my long position on having children is like, if you're a very smart woman, if you're a very intelligent person, if you found a nice, intelligent husband, the best thing you can do is do more than duplicate yourself. Because if you have the capacity to be a super intelligent engineer, genius is born, it is not taught. And so if you have 4 kids, now there are 5 engineers in the world instead of just 1.
Well, and I would also say,
so if you want your ideas, or if you want movement in the world to happen, one of the best ways to transfer those ideas, both genetically and through teaching, is by having children and having a relationship with somebody else who's like-minded. So, like, if you actually want this to change for everybody else for the future, more than just the extent of your lifetime, you got to invest in the next generation.
It's a very strong pronatalist case, but
I think
pronatalist. But I think as far as the taking power position, I'm suspicious of the people who say that they're like taking power means getting out of marriage because they have this need to proselytize it. They have this need to go around and share it.
That's why I'm like, be pronatalist and just to raise them from the cradle with these ideas. If you're such a proselytizer, like train them from birth.
No. But I mean to spread the ideas of not getting married.
Well, okay, hang on. I think I thought of the right analogy for this, and I do want to try. I promise I'm trying to wrap this up. But I'm going to have to give you a digression, which is that so many women complain all the time about the mental load. I'm sure if you are probably a man listening to this podcast, I'm sure your wife has said this word. I apologize on behalf of all women for the existence of this phrase. I hate it. The thing about the mental load, if you look at the list of all the stuff that women are like, oh, it's all these things.
So digression here on the digression, mental load refers to...
I'm about to explain.
Oh, okay.
The mental load is this list of all this stuff that your wife has to keep track of. That all women are over here with a running list of all everybody's doctors and when they last went to a doctor's appointment and who needs, who's growing out of this set of clothes and how much milk we have in the fridge and just all of this, the mental work that goes into taking care of a household and taking care of a family all falls onto the shoulders of women. And, it's so unfair the way it's distributed. I'm going to try not to go on a huge rant about it, but if you look at the list of the things that most women are complaining about perpetually being just overrun with and that their husbands don't help with, this invisible extra work that they do that their husbands aren't taking care of, a significant, if not majority role of it is external forces telling them to do stuff that they have now taken on as responsibilities that they actually have to meet.
That they've internalized.
Yes. Vaccine schedules, permission slips for school, who's making school lunches. If you're not going to a government school, all of those tasks just went away. If you don't necessarily buy into government programming on vaccines and well child checkups and all this other crap. Voting. All this other crap, like all these other, so many of the things that women are saying, like, oh my God, I'm so overloaded with the mental load, are actually external forces that women are then mad at their husbands for the fact that he's not willingly taking on this busy work that came with mostly government and outside
social media influence.
Social media, government, and insurance. Insurance
God,
needs. And the men are not picking up these burdens, but they're sending their kids to these, to school and whatever. And so now they have to meet all these requirements. And then the woman's taking it on. And now she's mad at him that he's not carrying his portion of this burden. If you go to base principles, you don't need to have that burden in the first place.
Where does this go back to the marriage versus I'm taking control by not getting married?
Most of these guys who are abstaining from relationships have internalized the idea. So how do I say? If the incentives are governmental and they say there's no way I can overcome the legal barriers, the social barriers, like whatever, and be able to have a successful relationship, I'll just stay out of it. They are in the same way that women are blaming men for not scheduling doctor's appointments because insurance told me you have to see that they want to see your kid every year.
Oh, I get what you're getting at. Men
are blaming women or a woman, whoever would be their wife, for all of the government's, mandates about how they're going to run common law, divorce proceedings, etc., etc. This weird thing where we will personalize and blame our partner or would-be partner for the ills of society but be very confident that it is my other person's fault. They are the one who actually has to rectify it, instead of recognizing that, like, we could opt out of some of these external systems and then they would actually be irrelevant to us. That, to me, would be taking your power back, saying, I don't want to send my kid to a government school that's going to mandate all these things all this busy work crap I have to do. I'm not going to get a government marriage, because the other side of having a legal marriage is that now there is precedent for the government to be the mediator if that relationship does dissolve. There is the other negative to having a legal marriage.
I will say, too, when you opt out and create your own systems with your spouse, suddenly you're not arguing with each other over what the correct way to do something is. In the way that, like you and I used to have arguments about the correct way to load a dishwasher. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly we got rid of the dishwasher and we wash dishes by hand now, and we don't have any arguments anymore. Nope. It's a world of our own creation that we're creating the system together.
Now we're just negotiating how we want to do it, not in a frame of one of us knows there's a right way to do it. We're just doing whatever's working for us.
Right. And I think that there's so much that is lost in the opportunity to build something meaningful with someone else by
ceding all of that to the government.
Mm-hmm. And not just ceding it to the government in the sense that, the law is the law, you can't help but cede it, but in letting those legal boundaries, which don't affect us 99% of the time, dictate our decision-making process of the relationships we start and the things that we do
on a day-to-day
in life.
Basis.
Yeah. So I think that was the longest wrap up we've done for a while. There's still probably a lot more to say about it, but I think
we kind of skipped over the problem with boys in schools.
There's so many things to say about it, but I think we did at least
cover the high points.
At least an introduction to what we could say are the pros and cons of the MRA movement. And there will be more to say, I'm sure. Maybe I'll do that debate with that one MRA at some point. But anyways, I think that's it for now. Thanks for listening. Oh God, an hour and a half. Take care.